Um, this is the time period 1901 to 1973, and I'm calling it Modernization and Social Upheaval. Well, the way we kind of left off last time was with a guy named Abdul Rahman Kahn, who was called the Iron Emir. Very brutal dictator, but he ended up developing a working relationship with the British, and so the British had control of his foreign policy, and he mainly focused on putting down revolts for his whole reign. So that's the kind of the situation we're picking up from. And what I want to do this time, the first thing we're going to see is as the British end up pulling out of India in the early 1900s, that's a major, geopolitical switch that happened. So that brought a lot of changes. And I'd kind of like to trace three things in this time frame. The first is a social clash that started to happen between the conservative Islamic faction and factions that wanted to modernize the country and become more Western. So started to see that conflict that is still going on today, but the roots of that are in this time period that we're going to be talking about. And secondly, I want to try to trace the roots of why Afghanistan's economy has continually been in shambles. Most recently, it's had been a constant war for the last 40 years. So that's a big reason. But even before that, it never had a strong economy. So we're going to try to see some of the reasons for that. And then lastly, in this time period, we're going to see the origins of the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan. Because when the British pulled out, they kind of gave the mantle of superpower in the region over to the United States. So from 1901 to 1973, the reason I chose 1973 there is that's when the last king of Afghanistan was deposed. The last of what you might call the Durrani line, which started, the first king we talked about when we started talking about Afghan history was Ahmad Shah Durrani, and in one form or another his descendants controlled the country down until about 1973. And in the late 1970s is when a communist coup happened and eventually a full invasion by the USSR. But this interim period between kind of when the British leave and when the war with the Soviets happened is what we're going to be talking about today. So anyway, just remind ourselves where Afghanistan is, right here. And the time period we're talking about today, we finally actually have this country, Pakistan. We're going to see how that came about. The British India included Pakistan, but that became its own country in 1947. In the time period we're talking about today, all this was part of the Soviet Union for most of the time period we're talking about. So keep that in mind. This again is the map of Afghanistan's geography. Just the main mountain range in the middle, with the Amu Darya River up here, and we ended last time by talking about the Durand Line, which was drawn by the British right here. That's the modern border, and then we have the Indus River here. Remember that. These are the main cities again: Mazar-e-Sharif, Herat, Kandahar, and Kabul is the capital. So we're going to pick up with Habib Khan. So he took over from his father in 1901. His father died, natural death, and Habib took over from him in one of the only peaceful transitions of power in Afghan history. And this was mainly due to a power-sharing agreement that was worked out. So it wasn't as uncontested as you might think, but some of the things he's noted for, we're going to look at his political achievements here. First of all, he exploited ambiguity as to whether the agreements made with Abdul Rahman, his father, between him and the British were personal or with the government in general. So what he said is, hey, I'm a new guy, I'm going to renegotiate my own agreements. The British wanted to say that the agreements were made with the country in general. Anyway, he capitalized on that and got permission to negotiate non-political agreements independently of Britain. So that was a small step towards Afghan independence. The first he also got the first formal recognition of Afghanistan as an independent state, albeit without control of its foreign policy. But, he got formal British recognition of that. He also conducted a several-month state visit to India, where British officials did everything they could to impress him with British power and technology, of course. But this was something that was rare for an Afghan monarch prior to this, partly because if you leave, someone else is likely to seize power when you're away, and also partly because to visit British India was a very unpopular thing to do at home. So he took some risks there, and his popularity suffered as a result. However, when he came back, he had seen the technology that was out there and the power that countries like Britain had because of it. And so he wanted to start to, you can imagine the cultural shock that would be, you visit Calcutta or something like that in India where it was a full modern city, and then you come back to Afghanistan where you have nothing. You have no paved roads. Everything's being done by horses and mules. And so he realized, we need to start making some changes here. We need to modernize ourselves. So he started some haphazard technological developments. So for one thing, he constructed some roads around Kabul so that he could drive his 2 Rolls-Royce cars that the British gave him. The roads didn't go anywhere, but at least he could drive around. He had telegraph links between his residence and the government buildings. He created first national flag and national anthem. He allowed Kabul's first newspaper, which was shut down after its first issue, and then reopened only to be shut down again when it published something against the British. So this is the beginning of Afghanistan's free press, which has never been very free. This is a good example of how that went. But he refused repeated British offers to connect Kabul and Kandahar to India by rail and telegraph, realizing that kind of connection would probably lead to his being deposed by people at home, and it also would provide the British easy military access. They could bring the troops in by rail then. So he refused. From an economic standpoint, that was a very bad move because it continued to be very difficult to get their exports out of the country because it all had to go by pack mule over the passes. But he was forced for political reasons not to allow it. While in India, he became a Freemason, much to the horror of more conservative elements in the country. No one's quite sure why he did it, but it was probably because most monarchs were Freemasons at the time, so he's probably trying to establish himself as on a level with everybody else. But this trip to India and some of the stuff he did started to create a rift between his government and the more conservative Islamic groups. So then we come to World War I, and in a major breach of treaty, he received a German Ottoman envoy, which he wasn't supposed to do under his agreements with the British. This was to treat with foreign diplomats independently. But, of course, Britain was in the middle of a world war. They weren't going to really do anything about it. So he got away with it, and the fact that he did that and got away with it was another step kind of toward independence from Britain. So that's kind of the political analysis of his reign. From a social standpoint, Habib allowed the return of activists that had been exiled by his father, Abdul Rahman. And the most influential of these guys was a guy named Mahmud Tarzi. And this guy is still in Afghanistan viewed as almost like a saint among certain people. But Tarzi grew up in Turkey and was part of the Young Turks movement. I don't know if any of you know anything about that, but that was instrumental in overthrowing the Ottoman control of Turkey and setting up a new social order. But basically, they believed in a blend of Islamic nationalism and social Darwinism. So their social ideas and how society ought to work came from Europe, and their religious ideas came from Islam. And they wanted a nation governed by Islam. They didn't want to just be Islamic. They wanted to have nation states. So he came back to was allowed to come back to Afghanistan. He started the Young Afghans, similar to the Young Turks. So the Young Afghans promoted radical technological and social transformation by moving away from tribalism toward a nationalistic mindset. So they wanted everybody to think of themselves as an Afghan, not as a Pushtun or a Tajik or whatever you might be. They wanted you to think of yourself as an Afghan. But what this meant in effect was Pushtunization. They wanted the Pushtuns to be the national identity. Now, this didn't really make any sense because almost nobody spoke Pushtu. A small minority of people did. And the Persian had always been the main language of court. The selection of Pushtun as the true Afghan national identity seems to have been partly based on the fact that most of these guys were Pushtuns themselves, and partly based on an Aryan ethnic theory which connected Pushtuns and Germans together as the master race. So that seems pretty far out there, and it's been debunked, but there was some scholars that came up with this idea that the Aryans were the father race to the Germans and the Pushtuns, and so that in their social Darwinism philosophy, that became the ideal for everyone to be Pushtun. So anyway, that's what they wanted. So these views were diametrically opposed to the traditional religious and political establishment, which subscribed to an interpretation of Islam that condemned Western technology and philosophy. So they didn't want any Western ideas coming in, basically. They wanted traditional Islam and a rule by Sharia law. So then at the center of this controversy was a college that Habib set up. It was called Habibiyah College, founded in 1903, and it was Afghanistan's first Western-style school, and it included courses in mathematics, geography, science, history. So basic stuff that most people in the West think is a good thing to know. But the conservative officials were very opposed to the school, maintaining that everything of importance was found in the Quran. So this became a flashpoint. So on two separate occasions, just to give you an idea of how this conflict worked out, on two separate occasions, conservative officials used assassination plots as a pretense. So someone plotted, they claimed, to assassinate the king. So they used it as a pretense to imprison and execute pretty much anyone they wanted. And in retrospect, it's likely that they probably fabricated the plots themselves just as an excuse to do this. But this was the beginning of a social conflict that rages to this day. The conflict between modernization on one hand and Western ideas and the Islamic conservative groups. This was the Islamic groups, the conservative Sunni Islam, has persisted. The modernization factor has passed between a number of different people, from the Young Afghans, then to the Soviets, then to the Americans after that. Various people that have come and wanted to introduce Western ideas into Afghanistan, and there's always been this resistance against that by the conservative Islamic groups, and most recently that has manifested itself in the Taliban. Yeah. Well, I'm gonna. I don't know. I think I'm gonna. My tack has been more to just kind of throw it out here, and people will have to kind of hash it out for themselves as far as what should be done. Here's what has been done, but what should be done is a whole other issue. So that gets us to the end of Habib Allah's reign. In 1919, he was assassinated by one of his bodyguards, actually. So after a brief struggle, his son Aman Allah came to power in a major victory for the young Afghans. So Aman Allah was not the heir apparent. He was not the oldest son, but he took the initiative and managed to seize power after his father's death. So there's inconclusive but pretty convincing evidence that Tarzi, that's that guy that is with the young Afghans, Tarzi himself was behind the plot. He certainly benefited since he had been grooming Aman Allah for years, and Aman Allah came to power with the intent on implementing Tarzi's vision. And there's some circumstantial evidence, like Tarzi was instrumental in getting that particular bodyguard appointed. It looks pretty likely that he was behind the whole thing. But anyway, Aman Allah became king, and a key tenet of Tarzi's nationalism was opposition to all British control. So he wanted an actual independent Afghanistan, and so that meant British control had to go. So in February 27, 1919, a week after taking power, Aman Allah declares independence from Britain and announces a jihad against British India. So not only does he say we're independent, we're actually going to attack India. So you can imagine this kind of caught the British off guard. And this is not a good time for the British either, because this is right at the end of World War I. They're in the middle of the Paris Peace Conference negotiating the end of World War I. Troops are in complete demobilization. They're going home. So it was a very poor timing. But the Aman Allah was counting on that fact that the British would really not want to be fighting now that just at the end of World War I. And also there was some unrest. He thought that there would be a big revolt in India if he came through. A lot of that didn't materialize, but anyway, so Aman Allah's plan consisted of a three-pronged attack. So he sent one army through the Khyber Pass. A second was to go a little further south and attack a city called Tal. Here's a map again. So here's the Khyber Pass. So one army was headed through there towards a city right here called Peshawar. Another was down here, and Tal is right across the Durand line. And then the third was supposed to come down to Kandahar and take control of the Kojak Pass down there. So, and a lot of this was under the pretense as well of recapturing territories that they had ceded away in the British agreements. So anyway, that was the idea. The problem started almost immediately. The third prong never even reached the Kojak Pass, since it had to be diverted to suppress a revolt in Kandahar. So there was just a transfer of power. Of course, that means people are going to revolt in Afghanistan. So they had to stop and put down a revolt in Kandahar. The first prong in the Khyber Pass, the guy that was in charge of that one just apparently wasn't a very good general. When he came to the first main British outpost, he decided to besiege it instead of taking it by storm. But the whole plan depended on smashing through quickly and taking Peshawar quickly. So he stalled for about a week, and then by that time the British brought up reinforcements and destroyed his army, routed him completely. And then by that time the other prong, number two, was getting ready to attack Tal. The British were able to bring troops off of the Khyber offensive down to and reinforce Tal, and that prong fell apart as well. And what ended up happening was that suddenly Aman Allah had three armies on his border, three British armies poised to attack. The British forces even took the initiative in the Kojak Pass. They took away some Afghan outposts. So it really looked like it was about to be a repeat of some of the things that had happened before, where the British just came in and toppled him. So the British actually even flew some bombing raids on Kabul. As far as we know, that's the first time any bombs were dropped in Afghanistan, first of many. But faced with the possibility of a British invasion, Aman Allah asked for a ceasefire only 1 month after the fighting started. So his little invasion of India lasted 1 month. So it was just a complete military disaster. But then he proceeded to bungle things at the negotiating table too. So the British did agree to relinquish control of Afghan's foreign policy. They decided there was a dispute, a pretty big dispute among British officials as to what to do. But they decided in the end that it would be better to just let them go and try to cultivate good relations with them as an independent country rather than going to the expense of trying to reassert their authority. So he got that. However, he lost his future subsidy. Remember, the British had always paid the Afghan monarchs subsidies in return for control of their foreign policy. And that was a big part of Afghanistan staying financially viable since it didn't have much of an economy. So they lost the subsidy. He lost the subsidy and all the subsidies that were held in Indian banks. So a lot of his money was held in Indian banks. He lost that. He lost British protection, and he also was reaffirmed the Durand Line. So he lost all those territories that ostensibly he was going to reclaim. Anyway, it was really a thinly veiled disaster. Aman Allah kept the terms of this agreement secret for years and launched a successful propaganda campaign claiming a glorious Afghan victory on the battlefield and the negotiating table. So he did a pretty good job, and some historians perpetuated that myth for a long time. But if you look at it objectively, it was a disaster. Yeah.
He must have done that with the cooperation of the British government, like, in terms of agreements with it.
It was to his own people mainly was his propaganda campaign. I mean, this was a pretty small, as far as the worldwide, this was a pretty small sideshow in what was going on, because this is right at the end of World War I. You know, they're redistricting Europe and all those things. So most people in the West really didn't know much about what was going on here.
So his people wouldn't have all these other channels to...
No. They had at this point, they had very little access to Western media at all. Yeah.
And when he declared independence, did he expect to keep the subsidy from the British?
I think perhaps he thought that he could be so successful on the battlefield that they would give him his subsidy anyway as part of a peace agreement. You know what I mean? Like, it was a pretty delusional attack. Yeah. But he thought there would be a huge revolt in the Pakistani area of India, and that they would help him. Then that would allow him to have a major victory, and then would force the British to the negotiating table. But yeah, it was a pretty delusional thing to do. Anyway, that was on the political side. That was kind of what he's most noted for. He also had Tarzi's vision of social reform, so radical modernization and westernization of the country. So he immediately implemented Tarzi's vision of westernized Afghanistan. He created Afghanistan's first constitution, began to work on a huge European-style palace complex where it was rumored women were allowed to walk around without a veil. That was absolutely horrifying to the conservative Islamic factions. Then one of his ideas, there's many others that I could mention, but one of his ideas was that all government employees were required to wear Western clothes. That didn't go over very well either. So this is Afghanistan's first constitution, 1924, first of many. Pretty much every new regime that came after him had a new constitution. So it outlawed the jirza poll tax, which is the tax on unbelievers. It outlawed levirate marriages and gifting women to solve feuds. It established a legislative council. So he thought, all the Western countries have legislatures, so we need to have one of those. But the king appointed all the legislatures and had the power to veto any decisions, so it was more of a... He didn't seem to quite grasp the overall idea of what a legislature is all about. But it left... One of the most important things was it left deliberately ambiguous whether the Constitution or the Sharia was the higher law. So it was edging the Sharia out of its traditional position. And it made another progressive idea was that it made primary education compulsory. So the Constitution led to an immediate rebellion in Khost, which is near Tal, and that's where the second prong went through. So Aman Allah had to get levies to suppress the revolt. The other tribes, however, refused to send troops until a new constitution was drawn up. So they said, as long as you have this constitution, we're not fighting for you. So the result was they drew up a new constitution that reversed all the progressive elements of the former constitution and was in strict adherence to conservative Sunnism. So they turned the whole thing around on him, and it ended up being a disaster. So the result was that they ended up suppressing the revolt, but the conservative elements got what they wanted anyway. So he should have learned his lesson after that, but 4 years later he announced even more radical changes, including outlawing polygamy, introducing Western schools in every province, and even requiring everyone in Kabul to wear Western clothes. To top it off, his wife ended the meeting where he announced all these changes by symbolically pulling off her veil. And that just kind of did it. Several provinces went into revolt immediately, and within a few months he was out of the country and lived the rest of his life in Italy.
What year are we at?
This is 1929. Sorry, I should have had that on there. But yeah, he was deposed in 1929. And so then another bloody civil war ensued. Nadir Shah came out on top. He was a war hero from the Third Anglo-Afghan War. And so he was eager not to repeat the mistakes of Aman Allah. So he pursued a strict Islamic policies. All women were required to wear a burqa in public and be accompanied by a male relative. He even created Afghanistan's first religious police to enforce the rules. And that was that. So you can see this conflict this is the roots of this conflict between conservative Islam and Westernization in Afghanistan. By this time, with the loss of that British subsidy, this was one aggravating factor in just an economic recession in Afghanistan. So one of his priorities was to revitalize the economy. So the way he decided to do that was he appointed a man named Zabuli, who was a merchant and a Soviet admirer. And he set up a central bank owned mainly by the government and its officials. And using the bank, he nationalized all the industries of Afghanistan, so to try to raise money for the government. So basically everything was owned by the bank, and the bank was owned by the government. So the result was a cross between socialism and crony capitalism by means of a central bank that also had control of the money supply and the exchange rates. So if that sounds like a recipe for corruption, you're right. So the government officials made huge profits at the expense of the general population. And these policies ended up chasing away most of the traditional merchant classes, including the Jews and the Hindus and the Sikhs, by making it impossible to do business except through the central bank. And if you did, then they took all the profits. So what was the point? They just left. So just disaster. Well, he lasted, until 1933. So he was only lasted 4 years. While attending a high school award ceremony, Nadir Shah was assassinated by one of the students who came from a rival family. So then the rest of the royal family took the opportunity to clean house and execute anyone they wanted to. But then something kind of different happened. So They installed his son, Nadir Shah, as the king, but instead of, they decided to invest the main power in a series of prime ministers, or premiers they called them. Now, there wasn't any substantial change because the prime minister essentially became the new king, but it was an interesting step away from monarchy. And that arrangement, from then on until 1973, Afghanistan was ruled by prime ministers. So that brings us to World War II. Despite repeated attempts by the Germans to get Afghanistan into the war with British India, the Afghan government remained neutral. The Germans did try to incite then revolts in India. Eventually they were caught smuggling weapons across the Durand Line into India, and all of them were expelled. So one success, I guess you could say, of British foreign policy was that Afghanistan stayed neutral throughout both world wars, which was a huge help to the British since they didn't have to open up another front. The main effect of World War II and the Great Depression was a devastation on Afghan economy. So their main export was sheep skins, which is like kind of a luxury item. So during the Great Depression and in the middle of war, there's not a huge market for luxury items, sheepskins. So they had a big economic crisis. So the way that the Zabuli and the government decided to go about solving this, so they had gotten a bunch of debts for infrastructure projects. So they decided it would be a good idea to export the country's wheat harvest in exchange for cash to pay their debts. What happened, though, was that there was nothing to eat then, of course. So they sold their main food product and then used the money to pay debts so that there was no capital and no food. So they had an even worse crisis. You can see the ineptitude of the economic policy here. So that brings us to another scheme called the Helmand River Project. And this is the beginning, I mentioned this because this is the beginning of American involvement in Afghanistan. So the scheme was to revitalize the Afghan economy by taming the Helmand River and using it to irrigate the desert. So this is the Helmand River in the south here, and most of the area around it is just desert because it's not irrigated. So the idea was irrigate it, and then we'll use the crops from that to export and make money. So the plan then was to take, when they irrigated the land, was to take nomads, Pushtun nomads, and settle them there, and they were going to raise the crops, and then the government would sell them. So they contracted with an American company called Morrison Knudsen, which had helped to build the Hoover Dam. That's where they came from. But despite having no experience in Afghanistan, they set up a subsidiary named Morrison Knudsen Afghanistan, and they got to work. Well, they immediately ran into problems because Afghanistan, you remember, they had no equipment, no paved roads, no skilled labor, so everything had to be brought in, and there was no roads to bring it in on. So the first thing they had to do was build roads to get the stuff there, which was an achievement in and of itself. So just getting the stuff there was a problem. Then when they did get it there, they soon realized that their original estimates of what it was going to take were way off. They were going to build some small dams, but they realized pretty soon that they were going to have huge dams upstream to effectively control the water. Because what would happen is the snow would melt in the spring, and it would be a torrent, and then in the middle of the summer, it would dry up. So they had to dam up the water to release it slowly over time to fill their irrigation ditches. And so the price just got out of control because the Afghan government was paying for this. And they were borrowing the money to pay for it. So then when they finally did get it all built, it turned out that the soil was very salty, and the salt got into the water canals, and then it turned into salt water, and so it killed the plants when it got there. So then they had to go through and concrete the canals at great expense. Then it turned out that the nomad farmers who were used to raising animals actually weren't very good farmers from a crop standpoint. So a lot of them just up and left. It was a disaster. The problem was, by this time, the project was too big to be abandoned. It was all bound up in the government's image, and but the returns were so low they couldn't even pay the interest on the money they had borrowed. So what happened then was that the U.S., this is now getting into the Cold War era, the U.S. said, this is our only image in Afghanistan. If we let this fail, it's going to make America look bad because it's our company doing it. So they started giving Afghanistan loans to pay for the project. And so those loans became the starting point for America's involvement in Afghanistan. So this project is the beginning of that. So that's kind of what's going on with the economy. And then lastly, I want to just talk a little bit about the political side of things over this time in the post-British era. So the British left in 1947, and they formed this country called Pakistan. So Pakistan, again, you have the Durand Line, and then they drew another line here in India, and they said everything in between there is Pakistan, and it's the homeland of the Muslims of India, basically was the idea. The Muslims and the Hindus couldn't get along, so they said we're going to make two separate countries, and that'll solve the problem. So what happened, though, was that this immediately resurrected the conflict of the future of the Pashtuns east of the Durand Line. That had always been a conflict between the Afghans and the British. What about all these people that are kind of ethnically Afghan that are over there? The British were always powerful enough that the Afghans couldn't do anything about it. But now it was Pakistan, this issue came up again. So the Afghan government, they had repeated agreements saying that, they weren't the Durand Line, affirming that. So they couldn't say, well, let's include them in Afghanistan. Instead, they said, let's create a separate country called Pushtoonistan and make a homeland for the Pashtuns. So that became the official government policy. Well, you can see that's a huge part of Pakistan right there, that they're just suggesting they carve out into another country. So Pakistan was very unhappy about that. So what had happened was there was a propaganda war, and then they started, both Pakistan and Afghanistan started funding insurgents in the other people's country. So it became like a proxy war, and they kind of hovered on the edge of having a major war for several decades. Finally, one thing that happened was in 1961, in an attempt to retaliate, Afghanistan closed its border with Pakistan completely, which was a very dumb thing to do because that was their main export route. That was how they got their stuff out. So they were shooting themselves in the foot, and Pakistan still had plenty of trade with India to keep them alive. But anyway, they kept it closed for 4 years. So that kind of gets us into Cold War politics. So what happened was, well, I'll just leave that issue for a second and talk about Pakistan. I'm going to come back to the Pushtoonistan thing. Pakistan, meanwhile, had formally joined an alliance with the U.S. as part of the Cold War containment strategy towards the Soviets. So the U.S. was trying to build this ring of U.S.-influenced countries around the Soviet Union to keep them from expanding, and Pakistan was one of those. But now Pakistan and Afghanistan are having this problem, so that kind of distanced the U.S. relationship with Afghanistan. They wanted to maintain a friendly relations, but they couldn't give military aid to Afghanistan. So what that did was, it meant that the USSR, the Soviets, was where the Afghans went to get their military equipment. So the U.S. started arming the Pakistan country, so most of their equipment was U.S. tanks and jets and stuff like that. And Afghanistan started buying all its equipment from the Soviets. So it kind of started tipping Afghanistan into the Soviet camp. And the Soviets also trained most of their officers. Most of their officers went to the Soviet Union, got their training, and then came back. And they imbibed a lot of those ideas. So then, as going back to the border conflict, as exporting through Pakistan became increasingly difficult, and then finally impossible when the border was closed, the USSR became an essential trade partner as well. So, again, started tipping them in that direction. Just as one example, Afghanistan was about to lose an entire crop of grapes because it couldn't be gotten to Pakistani ports because the border was closed. So the Soviets saved the day by airlifting all the grapes north to the Soviet Union. So they bought them all and airlifted them out. Then when they got them there, they realized that there was no market for the grapes in the Soviet Union, so they ended up destroying them anyway. But just that's an example of the dysfunction, some of the dysfunction that was going on here, but some of the things that started tipping the Afghan nation toward the Soviet sphere of influence. So it's a variety of economic and political factors. And yeah, I'm going to close with that. That kind of gets us up to the beginnings, to 1973 through 78, which is when the communists started really trying to take over politically. We're going to talk about that next time. But, well, anyway, any questions or any comments? You know.
So, I think sort of Pakistan wasn't one.
Right. 1947.
By the British.
Yes.
Pulled out of India. They still wanted a presence in the area.
Well, they had to, when they pulled out of India, they had to solve the problem of the fighting between the Hindus and the Muslims was one of the big problems that they were dealing with. Because basically what it looked like was and correct, some people may know more about this than I do, but when the British police really pulled out, it was just going to go into civil war. And to try to prevent that, they decided they actually made two, there was East Pakistan and West Pakistan, and West Pakistan is now Bangladesh on the other side. There's supposed to be two Muslim homelands, so that was the idea. And I guess it kind of worked. But what it's led to is very unpleasant relations between India and Pakistan ever since. But so kind of the three things I wanted to illustrate today was, number one, the roots of this social conflict between conservative Islam and westernizing ideas in Afghanistan. And that is continuing right up to the present. Secondly, the roots of their economic problems and the reasons why they have been unable to have any economy. And you can see it was because it was all done top down. All the infrastructure was built by the government, owned by the government. There was never any private capital at work, and it just didn't work. And then after the Soviet invasion, they've been at war ever since pretty much, so that isn't good for business either.
Are those dams still there?
They are.
Is that where a lot of the poppy fields are getting their
Yep.
water?
Another irony is that the U.S. created that place, and now a lot of it is used to grow.
It's been a CIA project from there.
Yeah.
Yeah. That pattern
Yeah.
of the United States going in, suggesting these massive capital improvement project fails, more money,
Mm-hmm.
in the end, the U.S. winds up controlling.
Mm-hmm.
That pattern repeated itself over and over and over in countries all over the world. There's a book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman.
Okay, I've heard of that. I haven't read it, but
You gotta read that, because it's exactly, I mean, what you showed there is exactly the pattern.
Mhm.
So, and the guy that wrote that book was right in the middle of it in a lot of countries in South America and other places.
Mhm.
And that just has repeated itself over and
Mhm.
over. So, John Burns.
we're going to talk about next time. We're going to talk about the Soviet infrastructure. The Soviet dealings in Afghanistan made the American aid look puny. They built huge roads and stuff, and the Afghan government was extremely in debt to the Soviets when they invaded. So there was that. There's the Cold War political aspect, and then there's that economic aspect.
This is a big, quite a bit at the beginning, but the question I have for you about the conservative Islam versus the more modern liberal. If they had not tried to impose Western ideas, would it have moderated a little bit over time? I mean, is there any indication that that imposition at too early a stage,
Yeah.
locked the conservatives into a mode that
Yeah.
they can't get out of.
There's actually very strong evidence that there was a polarizing effect where requiring all the women to wear a burqa, like making that a requirement, and things like that, that had never been a requirement. Like a lot of people did it, but when they had this vision of like overnight changing everything, it led to revolt, and then it got worse, from depending on whose standpoint you're thinking from. But yeah, I think that absolutely happened. There has been there was then, through a lot of the 20th century, there was a steady westernization of a lot of the cities, until the Taliban came in, which kind of took the mantle of that conservative view, and then they reinstituted the mandatory burqa and religious police and all that stuff. And now the United States has taken on the mantle of the westernizing, force, trying to force these radical changes on people, and you still have that same conflict. That's one of the things I want to emphasize. It's the same thing that was going on back there. It's still going on. Some things have changed, but you can see the pattern. So the social thing, the economic points, and also lastly the alliance of the U.S. with Pakistan is absolutely central to understanding U.S. foreign policy toward Central Asia. After the Soviets invaded, and until 2001 at least, that was the cornerstone of American foreign policy towards Soviet containment and all that stuff. And that helps explain a lot of things that happened there. But anyway, I guess we gotta close. Thanks all for listening, and next time we'll talk about the Soviet invasion. It was a really fascinating time.